What's up, guys? We want to take just a minute and shoot a quick video talking about something that came up in the sermon this past Sunday. So we were kind of working our way through Acts chapter 17, where Paul is in Athens, and he's provoked. It says the scripture says that his spirit is provoked when he sees the idolatry in the city. Athens had an unreal number of statues and temples and gods and all this stuff, and it just kind of messes Paul up. Anyway, so he begins talking, sharing the gospel really in the synagogue and in the marketplace, and through his conversations, he's invited to the Areopagus, which is kind of a court of philosophy and religion, if you will. So he's able to kind of defend what he's been preaching there. And so then we have this, it's recorded for us, like what he says and what he does. And it's interesting, he shares the gospel, he defends Christianity, but he doesn't start with Jesus. He really goes back, he starts with God, he talks about the doctrine of, he talks about creation and that God is not served by human hands, and he's benevolent and the giver of life. He goes on, he also talks about that God is a judge, that he'll judge the world through a man that he's appointed, Jesus, and that he has given us assurance about resurrecting him. So anyway, one of the things we talked about was the way that Paul contextualized the gospel, and I didn't take a whole lot of time to go into contextualization, so we want to shoot just a real quick video talking through that. So real quick, like circling back around and saying, what is contextualization? Contextualization, I would say, and you can jump into this too, contextualization is speaking into a particular story or situation. It's being considerate of the story of another, right? And so the example in Acts 17 is Paul is considerate of the philosophers that he's speaking to that are not Jewish, so Paul doesn't go assuming this background in Judaism, right? And we see this play out. This is part of my own story of faith, of as a young boy wrestling with and coming to a realization of my own sin. I started talking to my parents, and my parents called the pastor of my church at the time. It was P.J. Scott, old country preacher in Mississippi, and he came to my house, and he was Dr. P.J. Scott. He had a Ph.D., but he sat in the floor with me in my living room as an 8-year-old boy and explained the gospel in 8-year-old boy terms. Yep. He's not using seminary language. He contextualized the gospel and made it, put it on my level. And so that's really what we mean with contextualization, and it kind of opens up a broader conversation. So let's talk about that for a second. Like, what are some risks here, or what's the danger with contextualization, Brad?
Yeah, so basically when you think about the concept of contextualizing the gospel, like this big word, like Matt said, really just bringing the gospel to bear on someone in their particular story, their particular circumstances, really it's something that we do every single day. I mean, if you are actively sharing life with other people, and the reality that you go to church and that you believe in Jesus is evident in your life, it's quite likely that you've spent some time contextualizing the gospel with people in your life. And so, like Matt said, for me, very similarly, I became a Christian because of the death of a friend in high school. And it was a youth pastor who just sat down with me in the midst of that struggle of understanding the idea of death and mortality as a high schooler, that eventually led to the realization that there was a Jesus who loved me, who wanted me to have life and have it abundantly, and that there was a life after death for those who believed in him. And so, again, this idea of contextualization, meeting people with a real, actualized, historical gospel good news, with all that comes with your story in mind. And so when it comes to contextualization, there are risks of both over-contextualizing and under-contextualizing. So over-contextualization really looks like coming into somebody's life story or circumstance and, for all intents and purposes, really meaning well, but never quite getting to the point of actually sharing the good news with somebody. So you walk into their situation and you're trying to just be a good friend. You begin a conversation and you know, this is where a lot of like pop psychology can come into play. You just never quite get to the point where you say, hey, I know you're struggling with this life issue. But let me tell you about, there's this thing called sin. There's this thing called brokenness. There is this way that a creator, God of the universe, made the world to work in a certain way, and it has been broken by sin, by our sinful actions. If we never get to that point, and ultimately we just leave people thinking it's going to get better, or you're really a good person, it's going to be okay, you've left out the true hope. You left out the reality of what the gospel actually is. And we may think, and I catch myself doing this a lot, where I don't quite get all the way to contextualizing properly. Whether it's awkward or scary or makes me feel like I don't know enough, I just kind of skip over the gospel part in order to save a relationship or make it easier on myself. So that's really kind of over-contextual. Under-contextualization is similar in that we come at people in the midst of their struggle or situation, and we just kind of broadside them with like, well, listen, this is the gospel and you need it. Yeah, at the end of the day, you do need the gospel. We all agree with that. But to just come at them like a truck, and say, hey, it's this, this Romans road or this tract that I memorized, and it's this, and we totally miss out on helping navigate those waters with somebody, it could be ultimately off-putting or destructive to the relationship that you've been building with them in the process of sharing the gospel. The reality is that all we need is the gospel. All we need is Scripture to share the good news of Jesus with people. But like Paul said, like Matt said, Paul walked into the Areopagus and just shared in their context who God was, and that led up to who Jesus is. And so finding the ability to contextualize in the right way can seem overwhelming, but what it comes down to is just really having a firm grasp on both understanding the gospel and having biblical literacy. And so, Matt, you talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you're talking about the risk kind of on both sides of this thing. It seems like what freaks people out, particularly like Christians or church types, right, is the thought of over-contextualization is you're changing the gospel. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to change the gospel. We don't want to hold the line. We don't want to change the gospel. And then you're more like fundamental types generally end up under-contextualizing the gospel, and neither one of those is really faithful.
Right.
So yeah, what it takes for to do this well is, I think, and we've been talking about this some, is gospel fluency and biblical literacy. Kind of they kind of go together, intertwined. So gospel fluency with this idea of speaking the language of the gospel, that you understand the gospel across all of the biblical narrative. You understand what that is, and you're able, when you're fluent in a language, you're able to have a conversation and not just spit something that you've memorized out. And that's what we mean. It's like being fluent in that and being able to talk and listen. And biblical literacy is part of what strengthens that. Is if you know the Bible for what it is, not it's good to memorize text and memorize verses, but I think it's as helpful, more helpful to understand the meta-narrative of all of Scripture. How does this fit together? You understand the story of the Bible. And when you do that, now I can be considerate of whoever I'm talking to, considerate of their story, and speak into that. And really, this is an issue of discipleship, right? I mean, it's because contextualizing the gospel helps us be more effective and better faithful, more faithful and better Christians, really, right? And so this is an issue of discipleship, of if you are good at this, then you ought to, especially within our own church, if you're good at this, you ought to help somebody else that's not as good at this. Yep. And that's part of what discipleship is, right? It's helping each other and sharpening each other. And if you're not good at this, then there's all sorts of ways for you to get good at this. And we can pair you up. Reach out to Brad or I, and we can pair you up with somebody in our church that is good at this to kind of walk through this. Or Brad'd love to, sit down and grab coffee or Zoom call for a minute or whatever that looks like. And to kind of walk our way through, here's what this looks like, and let's work on some of this literacy, biblical literacy, gospel fluency, so that we can contextualize the gospel, so that we can be faithful witnesses, followers of Jesus, to walk in a manner worthy of our calling.
Yep. And ultimately, we want to be people of restoration. I mean, that's our name. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite examples of contextualization, in a sense, was Jesus with the woman at the well. I mean, Jesus entered into this woman's life who was coming to a well under what he knew to be not good circumstances. She was not with the other women, so there was something up. And so he enters into her conversation and her story and has this dialogue with her that really reveals her heart and her struggle and her sin. But through that, Jesus walks with her, ultimately revealing to her that she may be coming for physical water, but he has living water to give her. And then that conversation ends with him saying, I am the Messiah. The one you seek to worship, it's me. And that is what we seek to be, is people who enter into the hard things with people, and we walk through life, but we lead them to that place of true restoration. So once we get this idea of gospel fluency, biblical literacy, together we can train up ultimately our whole body to be able to take this to our community.
Good deal. Well, thanks for letting us take a minute and kind of clarify that, or take a little deeper into contextualizing the gospel. Hope you're doing well, and we'll catch up with you soon.